Welcome back, ladies and gents. Today's video is going to be about desktop environments. Now, in the Linux and open source world, there are a myriad of desktop environments to choose from. Now, this is in clear distinction to distributions of Linux that you can also choose from. Now, it's a common trope, and it's somewhat been propagated by channels like the very one you're on right here, is that the perfect distro or the perfect distribution of Linux is what will solve all of your productivity nightmares, and you'll be able to have the perfect computing experience if you just find the perfect distro. And this leads to people like myself hopping around the place trying out all kinds of different operating systems and different distributions of Linux to try and find that perfect combination. Now, recently, myself and definitely others in the Linux YouTube space have been feeling that honestly, it's probably not all about Linux distribution. We're all pretty settled on what Linux distribution we like, whether that's Manjaro, Ubuntu, Arch, Fedora. We all kind of understand the basics of what makes these distributions unique, and we've all probably settled in a particular camp or other, with a lot of the universal packaging formats and most desktop environments being widely available across a bunch of different distros. It makes the choice of what to run actually a lot more difficult because they're all such great quality options. So today's video is not necessarily about which distro is better than another, but more which are the best distros for each desktop environment. What's the best distro if you like KDE? What's the best distro if you like GNOME? So forth and so on. So hopefully this doesn't drag out too long. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep things fairly simple on my end here. I'm going to be showing you the web pages of these different projects, and then I'll bring in some B-roll of these distributions when I've checked them out here on the channel. So that is to say that some of the B-roll that you watch might be slightly dated versions of the current operating systems that we're talking about. But having said all that, let's get into it. Let's talk about the best distros for each desktop environment. We're going to knock out as many as we can. Let's do it. Okay, starting off, what I want to say is that coming off the back of my previous video, which was Manjaro Plasma, if you haven't checked that out, go and check that review out. Honestly, I believe that either Manjaro or, in some ways, its older, more mature and somewhat difficult sibling Arch are probably the best Linux options when it comes to running any and all combination of these desktop environments. For whatever reason, Manjaro, and by virtue of it being related to it, Arch Linux, are incredible when it comes to being able to run whatever desktop environment you want. KDE, GNOME, Budgie, you name it. Arch and Manjaro usually have packages for installing and running all of those desktop environments. So I'm going to say right off the rip that if you're interested in trying all of the desktop environments and you just want an underlying Linux operating system that can handle it, Manjaro or Arch is the way to go. Having said that, let's move on to specifics. So we'll start with GNOME, because honestly, GNOME is one of the biggest desktop environments out there in terms of how much time, money, and effort gets dedicated to developing it. GNOME as a desktop environment is shipping on pretty much all of the major Linux distributions. If not by default, it is at least an officially supported version of every major Linux distribution out there. However, I would recommend Fedora Workstation as your go-to distribution if you want to experience GNOME as the GNOME team have intended. What I will say is that GNOME also has their own, I guess, virtual image, or they have their own installation medium for their latest releases now that I think they're just calling GNOME OS, but it's not designed to be a full-on Linux distro replacement. It's just meant to act as a testbed, effectively, for GNOME and the new releases of stuff that they have going on. But GNOME Shell, GNOME 3, all of those goodies, I would recommend if you want to try that out and get the best representation of GNOME as GNOME envisions their project, then Fedora Workstation is the place to be. You get stable, performant, vanilla GNOME. I do want to preface what I'm saying and these choices by saying I'm trying to get as close to what the desktop environment is designed to be, but at the same time it gives a good blend of stability and customization and all the different things that are kind of important in an operating system as well. So these are 100% my opinion. These are not this is not hard and fast facts we're talking. This is my opinion. So KDE, this was a tough one because for most people, most Linux enthusiasts, when we think of KDE Plasma, we're thinking about the best distribution, which isn't really a distribution officially speaking, is KDE Neon, which is based on a long-term support release of Ubuntu, and then it has the latest KDE Plasma stuff packaged for that long-term support base. So it is kind of semi-rolling in that the core of the OS remains stable and only gets updated every 2 and a bit years, whereas the desktop and the applications that are KDE specific, they get updated constantly. I am going to go on record and say that I would actually recommend, if you like KDE, I actually think you get a better experience by running Kubuntu as your go-to option. If you really love the KDE desktop and you love Plasma, I think, and my experience has been, that you get a better product in Kubuntu than you do for KDE Neon. Some of the key reasons for this is app choice. You get a more up-to-date core OS, so more recent Linux kernel, more recent graphics drivers, etc. Although that is mitigated somewhat with the hardware enablement stack on LTS releases. The overall finished product that the Kubuntu team tie together, it just seems to me more stable and less buggy, just a better all-round experience on Kubuntu than KDE Neon. Okay, what about all of the Xfce folks out there? Now, for those of you who have already zoomed in on this video and you can see all the tabs I've got lined up, you know exactly where this video is going. But Xfce is also a hard one, because while it's very easy to stay in Ubuntu land and just go, oh, try Ubuntu, or it's easy to recommend Manjaro again and say Manjaro is probably one of the biggest distributions that recommends Xfce up front and center, I'm going to go with MX Linux. Because MX Linux is a wildly popular distribution for all the reasons that Xfce makes a great desktop environment. It's performant, it's very speedy, works well on older hardware, and it is very, very utilitarian. Utilitarian is like the key word when I think of MX Linux, because they have so many excellent custom tools that really make Xfce as powerful as it possibly can be without being a full-blown heavyweight desktop environment. Also, because Xfce, in my opinion, is not the prettiest thing out of the box, MX Linux kind of embraces that Spartan feel to its desktop environment, and it lets Xfce breathe and be its own thing, albeit its own early 2000s look and feel thing. So while MX Linux does have other spins available like KDE and Fluxbox, those came later. The Xfce desktop environment on MX Linux is a excellent utilitarian Spartan time for all of those who just want to do stuff with their computer in the most productive and old school sense of the word. All right, let's talk about Deepin. Deepin, it'd be easier for me to recommend running the Deepin desktop environment on Ubuntu Deepin Edition than on Deepin itself. And for all of the reasons that I've stated in previous videos, I will link up in the cards at my review of Ubuntu Deepin, and I'll probably have a link in the description somewhere about my review of the latest Deepin OS release. But there are a few key issues with Deepin as a Linux distribution that prevent me from recommending it, even though they're the ones that come up with the Deepin desktop. Go and get the Ubuntu Deepin version if you really love the Deepin desktop. Having said that, it is an older version of Deepin. Hopefully it gets updated. Well, I guess we'll wait and see. All right, let's talk about Budgie, an independent wildcard who is very valuable in the Linux space, in my opinion, is Solus. If you want to run the Budgie desktop environment, which is almost like a more traditional GTK-based GNOME desktop environment. So it's kind of like if GNOME 3 didn't want to introduce a whole new workflow to things, but kept a very traditional panel desktop Windows with all the window controls and all that kind of stuff. That's what the Budgie desktop would be. And the Budgie desktop has a lot of good stuff to offer. Solus are the ones that kind of originally officially came up with it, and so it remains the flagship experience on Solus, despite the fact that, once again, Solus now supports KDE, GNOME, and Mate alongside their Budgie edition. Solus in its own right as a distribution is fantastic. I ran it for almost a whole year between 2017, 2018, and then a little bit into 2019. And Budgie, even though development has slowed down compared to what it was, I guess we're still waiting to see what happens with future releases of Budgie. But yeah, Solus is still the best place to experience the Budgie desktop as it was originally envisioned. That leads us on to the Cinnamon desktop. And really, there's no other option to experience Cinnamon desktop in all of its quality other than Linux Mint. I mean, what did you expect? Linux Mint needs no introduction. Cinnamon is basically a very similar description to what I just gave for the Budgie desktop, but it is far more configurable. It has a far bigger user base and a lot more add-ons and extensions that make it wildly useful. I like to think of Cinnamon as basically a GTK version of KDE Plasma. That's a lot of jargon to throw into one sentence. It just means that if you like the smooth look and feel of a lot of Mac user experiences and user interfaces, but you want the configurability and the minute control that Windows gives you, and you want all that bundled in a Linux desktop environment, that's probably where I'd recommend Cinnamon. Really great desktop environment that has proven itself time and time again. It has extensive financial support behind the development of Cinnamon, and each release has just gotten better and better and better. So again, for people who are looking for a traditional desktop computer paradigm, the Cinnamon desktop on Linux Mint is one of the best in the business. So now, speaking of more Mac-like experiences, the comparison is very tied with the Pantheon desktop and Mac. I think there's actually less common ground now than there ever has been, but if you do like the idea of a minimal and focused desktop environment that gets rid of a lot of the distractions of operating systems nowadays and strips it back to the bare essentials and makes the bare essentials run really smoothly, then the Pantheon desktop, as featured on Elementary OS and largely developed by the Elementary OS team, is where it's at. At the moment, Elementary OS, and by extension, the Pantheon desktop environment, is my OS and desktop environment of choice. For right now, for where I'm at as a user, I have very limited time on my hands. So when I show up and do stuff on my computer, I don't want to have to update a bunch of things. I don't want a bunch of things moving around or constantly breaking. I just want a stable system that is really predictable, very minimal, and just gets out of my way. The same could also be said for GNOME, and that's why I jump back and forth between vanilla GNOME on Fedora and Elementary OS all the time, just depending on what I'm feeling at the time. So if you want to run Pantheon, Elementary, as most of you would already know, is the best way to do it. Mate is a fork of GNOME 2 that carries on the traditional desktop experience of yesteryear and keeps it rolling and updating with the latest GTK technologies just to keep everything working together. My recommendation, if you're looking for a Linux distribution that features the Mate desktop and really makes it shine, I would definitely recommend Ubuntu Mate. Once upon a time I would have said Mint, but nowadays I really feel like the amount of work and polish that goes into Ubuntu Mate is almost second to none. They make the Ubuntu Mate desktop look so good, and I really appreciate the work that goes into this particular project. Everything from different layouts from the desktop, from custom welcome apps and software boutique, and so many bits and pieces make this project amazing. But definitely strongly recommend Ubuntu Mate if you love a traditional, slightly older desktop experience, but one that is very productive, very configurable nonetheless. And now we get to the weird hybrid one, which is like the lightweight combination of some Xfce, some Cinnamon, some LXQt, and other bits and pieces, which I'm going to call the lightweight category, Peppermint OS. I haven't really talked a whole lot about Peppermint OS on this channel, but it has a very special place in a lot of users' hearts because it is able to take the best and most functional but lightweight pieces of a bunch of different Linux desktop environments and stitch together into one relatively cohesive operating system. It was originally designed as a lightweight desktop OS that could run really well on netbooks. But since then, it's evolved into its own thing. It definitely has amazing tools when it comes to integrating web apps into your normal desktop, which keeps everything running really light with minimal software footprint. But they keep evolving with each release of this distribution. So whether it's changing up what the file manager needs to be, or whether it's changing other default app selections or window managers, or rendering engines, or whatever it needs to be to keep this distribution focused on being very lightweight and very functional, the Peppermint OS team seem to be able to do it and do it well. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave this video. They're all my recommendations for running the major desktop environments out there, but there are so many honorable mentions that I could be here all day. I think for most regular users, when it comes to GNOME itself, there seems to be a lot of love around the internet right now for Pop! OS and how Pop! OS interprets GNOME, the GNOME desktop, because Pop! OS makes a lot of the changes that a lot of users make by default when they first run GNOME. And also their recent addition of a tiling window manager makes it super appealing to a lot of power users and people that have a lot going on their desktop at any given time. So I will give an honorable mention to Pop! OS if you are interested in most of the workflow that GNOME offers you, but you're not down for how minimal or how fewer options are enabled by default. Well, that about does it for me. I hope this video was helpful for you. Please share it around and give the video a thumbs up. It always helps out the algorithm. And subscribe if you like this stuff on a regular basis. And I will see you all in the very next video. Peace.